On a cold spring morning in the Norwegian Sea, 42 men are alive inside a hull of titanium that is stronger than any other vessel on Earth. They are surrounded by the most advanced engineering the Soviet Union ever produced, believing they are safe within a fortress designed to withstand the crushing weight of the deep ocean. But within hours, they will learn that technology cannot save you when the system that built it has already failed. On April 7, 1989, the submarine known as K-278 Komsomolets was moving quietly through the depths. It was not at war. It was not under attack. The ocean surface above was calm, and the political storms of the Cold War were beginning to thaw. Yet by the end of the day, this vessel, one of the most expensive and sophisticated machines ever built by human hands, would be lying broken on the seabed. The tragedy of K-278 is distinct because it lacks the sudden, violent clarity of other disasters. It did not explode instantly like the Space Shuttle Challenger. It did not disappear into the void without a trace like the USS Thresher. Instead, it died slowly. It failed while its crew followed procedures. It sank while its officers trusted their instruments. It was lost while help was already on the way. 42 men would eventually lose their lives, not because the rescue forces were indifferent, but because of a brutal mismatch in timing. Rescue operations work on a schedule of hours. The human body, immersed in the freezing waters of the Arctic, operates on a schedule of minutes. This narrative is not a story about incompetence or cowardice. To the contrary, the logs show acts of extreme discipline. It is, fundamentally, a story about the paradox of systems. It forces us to ask how a nation can build a spaceship for the ocean, a machine capable of feats that Western intelligence agencies thought were impossible, while simultaneously failing to provide the basic organizational software required to keep it safe. At the center of this story is the Norwegian Sea, a vast, unforgiving stretch of water that has swallowed sailors for centuries. And at the center of the sea is the K-278, a submarine that was intended to be the future of naval warfare, but instead became a monument to the limitations of human control. To understand why the loss of this submarine was so shocking, we must first understand what it was. K-278 was not a typical Soviet patrol boat. It was a singular creation, the only vessel of its class, known to the designers as Project 685 Plavnik, and to NATO by the codename Mike. In the 1970s and 80s, the underwater arms race was defined by depth and speed. The deeper you could dive, the harder you were to detect, and more importantly, the harder you were to kill. Standard steel submarines have a limit. As they descend, the pressure of the water pushes against the hull with millions of pounds of force. If a steel boat goes too deep, the metal fatigues, buckles, and eventually implodes. The Soviet engineers at the Rubin Design Bureau chose a different path. They chose titanium. Titanium is a metal of contradictions. It is incredibly light, roughly half the weight of steel, yet it possesses a tensile strength that rivals the hardest alloys. It is non-magnetic, meaning a titanium submarine is invisible to the magnetic anomaly detectors used by NATO patrol aircraft. It is immune to corrosion. A titanium hull can sit in salt water for 100 years and never rust. But titanium is also notoriously difficult to work with. It cannot be welded in the open air. If hot titanium touches oxygen, it becomes brittle and cracks. To build the K-278, the shipyards had to construct massive sealed hangars filled with argon gas. Workers wore pressurized suits, like astronauts, welding the hull segments together in an alien atmosphere. The result was a masterpiece of metallurgy. The inner pressure hull of the K-278 was a perfect, rigid cylinder capable of withstanding pressures that would crush a standard American submarine like an aluminum can. The capabilities of this machine were proven in August 1985, 4 years before the disaster. The K-278 conducted a test dive that redefined the geometry of naval warfare. The boat descended past the standard operating depths of 1,000 feet, past the emergency limits of 2,000 feet, and kept going. It finally leveled off at a depth of 3,370 feet. At this depth, the ocean is a world of absolute darkness. The pressure is over 1,500 pounds per square inch. For context, most American torpedoes at the time were designed to crush at roughly 2,500 feet. The K-278 could essentially hover in the abyss, below the reach of enemy weapons, listening to the ocean with impunity. From this vantage point, it was the ultimate predator, untouchable, invisible, and lethal. This record-breaking dive created a sense of invincibility around the boat. The crew called it the Golden Fish, a reference not only to its immense cost, but to a Russian fairy tale about a fish that grants wishes. It was widely believed within the Northern Fleet that the titanium hull was indestructible. It was a fortress that could survive anything the ocean or the Americans could throw at it. However, invincibility is a dangerous illusion. The hull was indeed strong, but a submarine is more than just a metal shell. It is a complex organism of pipes, wires, valves, and human beings. And while the hull belonged to the 21st century, the internal systems and the doctrine used to operate them were firmly rooted in the rigid, bureaucratic past. Inside this titanium cylinder, the Soviet Navy packed enough energy to power a city and enough firepower to destroy one. The heart of the ship was a specialized, pressurized water reactor, producing 190 megawatts of thermal power. It drove a massive single propeller shaft, pushing the boat through the water at speeds exceeding 30 knots. The weapons room was equally formidable. The K-278 carried a mix of torpedoes and cruise missiles. Crucially, 2 of these torpedoes were armed with nuclear warheads. These weapons contained plutonium-239 cores designed to detonate underwater and create a shockwave capable of wiping out an entire American carrier battle group. But perhaps the most advanced piece of equipment on board was not a weapon, but a safety device. The designers knew that at 3,000 feet, traditional escape methods were impossible. You cannot open a hatch and swim to the surface. The pressure would kill you instantly. So, they built an escape capsule. Located in the sail, the tower that rises from the hull, this capsule was a mini-submarine in its own right. It was designed to detach from the main body of the boat, carrying the entire crew of roughly 60 men safely to the surface, even from extreme depths. It was a technological marvel, a testament to the fact that the engineers cared deeply about crew survival. Yet, as we will see, the presence of a safety system is not the same as the ability to use it. The capsule sat there, integrated into the hull, a silent promise of salvation that had never been tested in a real emergency. Technological hardware, no matter how advanced, requires human software to run it. The crew of the K-278 was elite. They were hand-picked officers and warrant officers, many of whom were experts in their fields. The Soviet Navy did not put conscripts in charge of a billion-dollar prototype. However, these men were trained within a specific military culture. The Soviet naval doctrine of the late 1980s was a system built on checklists, rigid hierarchy, and compartmentalization. Information was often hoarded rather than shared. Procedures were written for the average submarine, not necessarily for the unique quirks of an experimental vessel. Historians of the Soviet Navy, such as Norman Polmar, have noted that while Soviet engineering often pushed the boundaries of physics, their damage control procedures lagged behind. The training emphasized protecting the secret of the submarine over the safety of the submarine. In a crisis, the instinct was to seal the compartment, contain the problem, and wait for orders. This created a fatal gap. The K-278 was a machine that demanded rapid, flexible decision-making. Its systems were interconnected in complex ways. A failure in one system could cascade into another with terrifying speed. But the crew was operating with a mental manual written for older, slower, simpler boats made of steel. This brings us to the core contradiction that defines the disaster. The K-278 was a paradox. Physically, it was a leap forward. It used materials and hydrodynamics that Western engineers are still studying today. It was a triumph of Soviet science. Culturally, it was stagnant. It operated under a system where admitting a defect was dangerous to one's career. It was part of a fleet where readiness reports were often more important than actual readiness. On the morning of April 7th, 1989, this gap between the machine and the system was invisible. The boat was patrolling at a depth of 1,200 feet, moving slowly at 8 knots. The crew had just finished lunch. The second shift was taking over the watch. The reactor was humming quietly, providing heat and light and propulsion. The commander, Captain First Rank Evgeny Vanin, was an experienced officer. He had faith in his ship. He had faith in his crew. He had no reason to suspect that a small electrical component in the stern of the boat, a component worth perhaps a few rubles, was about to challenge the integrity of a billion-ruble titanium hull. The ocean outside was 39 degrees Fahrenheit. It was cold, dark, and heavy. The pressure against the hull was immense, but the titanium held it back with ease. The danger on that morning was not outside the boat. It was inside. Deep in the 7th compartment, in the very rear of the submarine, the air was still. This compartment housed the steering gear, the aft controls, and heavy electrical machinery. It was the furthest point from the command center. In a complex system, disaster rarely announces itself with a shout. It begins with a whisper. A wire overheats. An oil seal leaks. A sensor fails to register a spike in temperature. The K-278 was designed to survive a direct hit from a torpedo. It was designed to survive the shockwaves of a nuclear blast. But it was not designed to survive the seemingly minor failure of its own internal wiring in a way that the crew could manage. As the clock ticked toward 11 a.m., the first molecules of smoke began to drift into the air of the 7th compartment. The golden fish was about to face a test that no amount of titanium armor could help it pass. The paradox was about to collapse. The machine from the future was about to be destroyed by a fire that burned with the fury of the past. And the men inside, confident in their fortress, were just minutes away from a decision that would seal their fate. At 11:02 in the morning, the illusion of safety inside the titanium hull begins to unravel. The submarine is cruising at a depth of 1,250 feet, deep enough that the water pressure alone would instantly crush a human body. Yet, inside the climate-controlled compartments, the atmosphere is calm. But in the 7th compartment, the furthest section of the ship towards the stern, a single sensor detects a rise in temperature. The sailor on duty in this isolated space is seaman Nodar Buknikashvili. He is alone. The compartment houses the heavy machinery for the steering systems and the oil separators for the generators. It is a noisy industrial space, filled with the smell of warm oil and ozone. When the alarm triggers, it is not a screaming siren, but a specific light on the control panel in the central command post, hundreds of feet away. Buknikashvili's voice comes over the intercom. He reports a fire. His voice is tense but controlled. In the rigid hierarchy of the submarine service, panic is a dereliction of duty. He reports smoke and flames near the electrical switchboards. In the central command post, Captain Vanin receives the report. For a submarine commander, fire is the ultimate nightmare. On a surface ship, you can retreat from a fire. You can vent smoke into the atmosphere. Underwater, the submarine is a sealed tube. A fire consumes the same oxygen the crew needs to breathe, and it replaces that oxygen with carbon monoxide and toxic smoke from burning insulation. The margin for error is measured in seconds. Captain Vanin makes the immediate doctrinal decision. He orders the fire suppression system activated for the 7th compartment. This system, known as LOCK, is designed to flood the burning area with freon gas, chemically inhibiting the combustion. It is a brutal but necessary measure. Activating it essentially makes the compartment uninhabitable for any human inside without breathing gear, but it saves the ship. But the fire in the stern is not behaving according to the manual. It is growing with an intensity that defies the suppression system. The flames are fed by high-voltage electrical arcing and possibly a spray of oil. The temperature spikes rapidly, turning the atmosphere inside the compartment into a toxic smog. Buknikashvili stops responding to the intercom. The silence from the stern is the first casualty of the day.
Vanin now faces a critical choice. The submarine is deep. The fire is uncontained. If the hydraulic systems in the stern melt, the diving planes could jam, sending the boat into an uncontrolled dive that would end in hull crush. Or the fire could spread forward, consuming the reactor controls. The Soviet naval doctrine is clear. When stability is threatened, you must bring the boat to the surface immediately. He gives the order to blow the main ballast tanks. This action is standard procedure. A submarine stays submerged because its ballast tanks are full of water. To surface quickly, specifically in an emergency, the crew forces high-pressure compressed air into those tanks, pushing the water out and making the boat buoyant. It is a violent, powerful maneuver designed to shoot the submarine toward the surface like a cork. The crew executes the order. They open the valves to send high-pressure air into the aft ballast tanks located near the 7th compartment. They are following the checklist. They are doing exactly what they were trained to do to save the ship. But they do not know that the fire has already changed the physical reality of the submarine. Inside the burning 7th compartment, a high-pressure air line, part of the system used to blow the ballast tanks, has been compromised. The intense heat has likely weakened a seal or melted a section of piping. When the crew opens the valves to save the ship, the compressed air does not go entirely into the ballast tanks. Instead, a jet of high-pressure air screams directly into the burning compartment. This moment is the turning point of the disaster. Until now, the fire was a dangerous but potentially manageable industrial accident. But with the injection of high-pressure air, the fire is transformed. The compartment is no longer just burning. It is being fed by a blast of oxygen-rich air under tremendous pressure. It becomes a blast furnace. The effect is similar to a blacksmith pumping a bellows into a forge, but on a catastrophic scale. The temperature in the 7th compartment shoots up instantly. It exceeds 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, then 2,000 degrees. The fire burns so hot that it ceases to consume just flammable materials like oil and rubber. It begins to attack the structure of the submarine itself. The paint blisters and vaporizes. The aluminum walkways melt. The fire is now a pressurized inferno, consuming everything in its path. This is what safety engineers call a latent condition accident. The crew's action was correct, the design was advanced, but a hidden flaw, the vulnerability of the airline to heat, turned a safety measure into an accelerant. By trying to surface the ship, they have inadvertently fed the monster that is killing it. The consequences of this blowtorch effect are immediate and terrifying. The cables running through the bulkheads, the heavy bundles of wires that connect the stern to the brain of the ship, begin to burn through. This severs the connection between the command post and the ship's control surfaces. The rudder jams. The signals from the engine room become erratic. More dangerously, the heat begins to threaten the pressure hull itself. The titanium shell is incredibly strong, but even titanium has a melting point. More immediate, however, is the threat to the internal bulkheads, the walls separating the compartments. The 7th compartment is now a pressurized bomb of heat. The seal separating it from the 6th compartment begins to fail. Smoke and heat are forcing their way forward, driven by the overpressure. In the 6th compartment, situated next to the inferno, the crew is fighting for their lives. They can feel the heat radiating through the steel wall. The paint on their side of the bulkhead begins to smoke and peel, a terrifying indicator of the temperature on the other side. They are scrambling to put on their breathing apparatus, the Ida 59s, which are cumbersome and difficult to use in a panic. Meanwhile, the submarine is responding to the ballast blow. It begins to rise. The nose angles up. The depth gauge starts to spin. 1,000 feet, 800 feet. 500 feet. The ascent is steep and rapid. Loose equipment slides across the decks. The sensation of rising brings a momentary wave of relief to the men in the forward compartments. They are escaping the deep. They are heading toward the air, toward the radio, toward help. But the ascent also brings a new set of physics into play. As the submarine rises, the pressure of the ocean outside decreases. This means the pressure inside the burning compartment becomes relatively higher. The fire is pushing out with even more force. The smoke is seeking any exit it can find. The ventilation system, which runs through the length of the boat, becomes a highway for the toxic gas. The fire has burned through the valves that are supposed to seal off the compartments. Carbon monoxide, an invisible and odorless killer, begins to bleed into the other sections of the boat. It moves silently into the 6th compartment, then the 5th. Men who are manning their stations, waiting for orders, suddenly feel dizzy. Their vision tunnels. Some collapse over their consoles before they even realize they are being poisoned. The discipline of the crew holds, but biology is beginning to fail. Captain Van In is in the command center, trying to synthesize a picture of the disaster from a stream of chaotic reports. He knows he has lost the stern. He knows he has fire on board. But he likely does not understand the full magnitude of the rupture in the airline. He believes he is managing a fire, not a structural meltdown. His priority is the reactor. The nuclear plant is operating, driving the ship upward. But with the cooling systems in the stern compromised and the control cables burning, the reactor is at risk of a meltdown. The officer in charge of the reactor, Captain 3rd Rank Vyacheslav Yudin, realizes the danger. If the reactor runs out of control, the K-278 will not just sink, it will become a radioactive steam bomb. As the boat rockets toward the surface, the reactor team initiates the scram procedure, the emergency shutdown. The control rods slam into the core, killing the nuclear reaction. The hum of the turbines begins to fade. The boat loses its primary power. It is now dead in the water, a drifting metal tube carried upward only by the bubble of air in its tanks. The silence that follows the reactor shutdown is heavy. The lights flicker and switch to emergency battery power. The bright clinical lighting of the operating room is replaced by dim amber emergency lamps. The air grows thick. At 11:16 a.m., just 14 minutes after the first alarm, the K-278 breaks the surface of the Norwegian Sea. It breaches violently, foam cascading off its black titanium flanks. It settles into the swell, rolling slightly. To a casual observer, the crisis might appear to be over. The submarine has surfaced. The reactor is safe. The crew is alive. They have escaped the crushing pressure of the deep. They can open the hatches. They can breathe fresh air. But this is a deception. The surfacing has not saved the ship. It has merely moved the disaster to a different coordinate. The fire in the stern has not been extinguished by the ascent. It has been emboldened. By surfacing, the crew is about to introduce a fresh supply of oxygen to a fire that is already consuming the ship's vitals. Inside the hull, the temperature in the 7th compartment continues to climb. The metal is glowing. The hydraulic fluid in the lines is boiling, and the bulkhead separating the fire from the rest of the ship is groaning under the thermal stress. The men in the forward compartments begin to unseal the hatches, desperate for air. They climb up the ladders into the cold April wind. They look out at the grey horizon of the Norwegian Sea. It looks like salvation. They do not yet realize that they have climbed out of a burning coffin only to step onto a sinking one. The inferno below has done its work. It has destroyed the integrity of the submarine. Now, the surface trap begins. The fire is no longer the only enemy. The ocean, patient and freezing, is waiting for its turn. And the clock that dictates survival is about to speed up, leaving the crew of the K-278 far behind. At 11:16 a.m., the K-278 Komsomolets is floating on the surface of the Norwegian Sea. From a distance,
The submarine looks intact. Its black, hydrodynamic sail rises proudly above the waves. The titanium hull, still wet from the depths, gleams dully under the overcast sky. But inside, the ship is dying a complex, agonizing death. Surfacing has brought immediate relief to the crew in the forward compartments. The crushing pressure of the deep is gone. They can crack the hatches. They can breathe air that isn't tainted with the acrid stench of burning plastic. For a few moments, the panic recedes. They have done what every submariner is trained to do. They brought the boat up. But this sense of security is a cruel illusion. The fire in the stern has not stopped. It has merely changed its appetite. Now that the submarine is on the surface, the dynamic of the disaster shifts from immediate survival to a slow, grinding battle of attrition. The first critical error occurs almost immediately after surfacing. In the chaos of the ascent and the desperate need to clear the smoke from the inhabited compartments, the crew opens the ventilation hatches. It is a natural human instinct: get the poison out. But on a ship designed as a sealed system, every opening is a liability. The fresh Arctic air rushes into the submarine. It clears the smoke, yes, but it also rushes toward the fire in the stern. The flames, which had been choking on their own fumes, are suddenly revitalized. The inferno in the seventh compartment roars back to life with renewed fury. The temperature, which had stabilized, begins to climb again. Meanwhile, the reactor crew has performed their final heroic duty. They have confirmed that the nuclear core is shut down and secured. The control rods are locked in place. The cooling pumps are running on battery power. They have prevented a Chernobyl at sea. But in doing so, they have also cut the ship's primary source of energy. The K-278 is now running on its emergency batteries. These batteries are finite. They provide power for the lights, the radios, and the pumps. But as the fire burns through electrical cables in the stern, short circuits begin to drain the batteries at an alarming rate. The lights dim. The hum of the ventilation fans falters. The ship is losing its nervous system. While the fire rages aft, a new threat emerges, one that is quieter, but more deadly. The intense heat in the stern has damaged the seals on the through-hull penetrations. These are the holes where cables and pipes pass through the titanium pressure hull to the outside ocean. Usually, they are watertight, but at temperatures exceeding 1,500 degrees, the rubber gaskets disintegrate. The metal fittings warp. Water begins to seep into the seventh compartment. At first, it is a trickle, then a spray, then a steady flow. The high-pressure compressed air that was blown into the ballast tanks to surface the ship is also leaking. The valves, damaged by the fire, are failing. The air that is keeping the stern afloat is bleeding away, and the water that drags it down is pouring in. The submarine begins to settle. It is imperceptible at first, a slight heaviness in the stern. The trim of the boat shifts. The bow rises slightly. The tail drops. Captain Van In is in the command post, coordinating the damage control. He is fighting a war on two fronts. He sends damage control parties aft to inspect the bulkheads. They report that the steel walls are hot to the touch, hot enough to blister skin. They can hear the fire roaring on the other side. They spray water on the bulkheads to cool them, to prevent the fire from burning through to the next compartment. But Van In is also fighting a war against geography. He orders the radio operator to send a distress signal. At 11:37 a.m., the coded message bursts from the antenna. "Fire on board! Request assistance!" The signal is picked up by the Northern Fleet headquarters. The machinery of rescue begins to turn. In Murmansk, admirals are woken. Orders are shouted over secure phones. At airbases on the Kola Peninsula, pilots sprint to their aircraft. Rescue ships and tugs are diverted from their patrols. On paper, the response is swift. An Ilyushin IL-38 maritime patrol aircraft takes off. It will reach the submarine in a few hours. A floating factory ship, The Alexei Klobestov is in the area and turns toward the coordinates. Everything is working as designed. The system is responding. But here enters the tragedy of the clock of the cold. The K-278 is located roughly 100 miles southwest of Bear Island. The water temperature is between 35 and 39 degrees Fahrenheit, 2 to 4 degrees Celsius. Captain Van In and his officers do calculations. The rescue ship is 50 miles away. At full speed, it will take at least 6 hours to arrive. The aircraft can drop rafts, but it cannot pick men out of the water. The math is simple and brutal. The submarine must stay afloat for 6 hours. If the hull fails before the ships arrive, the crew will go into the water. And in 39-degree water, the human body does not last 6 hours. It does not even last 1. Cold shock is the first phase. When a human hits freezing water, the body reacts with an uncontrollable gasp reflex. If the head is underwater, the person inhales water and drowns instantly. If they survive the shock, cold incapacitation sets in within 10 to 15 minutes. The blood vessels in the extremities constrict to save heat for the core. The muscles in the arms and legs lose their blood supply. They stiffen. Nerves stop firing. A strong swimmer loses the ability to keep their head above water. They do not die of hypothermia. They die of drowning because their hands can no longer grip a raft or tread water. True hypothermia, the drop in core body temperature that stops the heart, takes about 30 to 45 minutes. So the window for survival is roughly 45 minutes. The rescue is 6 hours away. The gap is fatal. This reality creates a terrible trap for the crew. Staying on the burning submarine is dangerous. The smoke is toxic. The radiation risk is unknown. The ammunition could explode. But leaving the submarine is a death sentence. The crew clings to the hope that the titanium hull will hold. They believe the K-278 is unsinkable. It is, after all, the golden fish. It has survived the deep. Surely it can survive a fire on the surface. This belief is reinforced by the lack of visible external damage. From the deck, the submarine looks solid. The sailors huddle on the casing, smoking cigarettes, watching the sea. Some are wearing only their light cotton service uniforms. They evacuated in a hurry. They did not grab their survival suits. Why would they? The submarine is floating. They expect to be towed back to port. But inside, the battle is being lost. The stern is getting heavier. The water rising in the 7th compartment is extinguishing the fire, but it is replacing the buoyancy of air with the dead weight of the ocean. Around 1 p.m., the trim becomes noticeable. The stern is sitting lower in the water. The waves are lapping higher up the black sides of the hull. Panin orders the non-essential personnel to prepare for evacuation, just in case. But there is a cruel irony here. The K-278 has survival rafts. They are stored in canisters on the deck, but to deploy them, you need time and stability. As the afternoon wears on, the situation deteriorates exponentially. The fire has burned through the hydraulic lines that control the ballast vents. The crew tries to blow the remaining tanks to restore buoyancy, but the system is unresponsive. The compressed air hisses uselessly into the sea or back into the compartments. The IL-38 aircraft arrives overhead. The pilot looks down and sees the long, black shape of the submarine, trailing a plume of smoke. He sees the men on the deck. He radios that help is coming. He drops a survival container, but it drifts away in the wind. The sight of the plane offers a psychological boost, but it changes nothing about the physics of the sinking. The plane cannot lift the submarine. It cannot heat the water. It can only watch. By 4 p.m., the list is severe. The submarine is tilted back at a steep angle. The water is washing over the aft stabilizers. The ocean is claiming the K-278 inch by inch. Inside the command post, the mood shifts from damage control to resignation. The reports from the aft compartment stop. The bulkheads have failed. The water is advancing forward. The unsinkable ship is sinking. Captain Vanin realizes they have lost the race.
The rescue ships are still hours away. The submarine will not last that long. He gives the order. All hands to the deck! Prepare to abandon ship! This order marks the end of the technical phase of the disaster and the beginning of the human tragedy. The men begin to climb out of the hatches. They are leaving the warmth, however toxic, of the boat for the freezing clarity of the Norwegian Sea. Many of them are ill-prepared. In the confusion, survival suits were left behind or are inaccessible. Some men are wearing heavy coats that will drag them down when wet. Others are in shirt sleeves. They step out onto the tilting deck, the wind cutting through their clothes. They look at the water. It is black and cold. It looks like death. The system has delivered them to this point, alive, afloat, but stranded in a gap between the capabilities of their machine and the limits of their biology. The fire did not kill them. The radiation did not kill them. But the clock is about to run out. As the stern dips below the waves, the K-278 begins its final slide backward. The men on the deck scramble toward the bow, trying to stay dry for a few more seconds. But gravity is relentless. The angle steepens. One by one, they begin to slide into the water. The agony of the sea has begun. By late afternoon, the fight to save the K-278 Komsomolets is over. The submarine has lost its battle with buoyancy. The stern is heavy, dragging the vessel down by the tail, and the angle of the deck is becoming dangerously steep. The order to abandon ship has been given, but as the 69 men on board scramble toward the freezing air, they are about to discover that leaving the submarine is only the beginning of the nightmare. This phase of the disaster, the agony of the sea, is characterized by a brutal collision between Soviet naval protocol and physical reality. On paper, the evacuation should have been orderly. The K-278 was equipped with inflatable life rafts stored in recessed canisters on the deck. Each man had been issued a personal breathing device and should have had access to thermal protection. In reality, the evacuation is a chaotic scramble for survival. The submarine is listing heavily to one side, making the wet titanium deck as slippery as ice. The smoke pouring from the open hatches is blinding. The roar of escaping steam and the groaning of the hull creates a cacophony of industrial death. The crew attempts to deploy the life rafts. These rafts are heavy, cumbersome packages designed to inflate automatically when thrown into the water. But the listing of the ship makes them nearly impossible to handle. One raft is successfully launched. It inflates, a bright orange blossom on the dark gray water. But the wind catches it immediately. It drifts away from the hull, bobbing violently in the swell. A second raft is launched. It hits the water upside down. There is no easy way to flip a massive rubber raft in freezing seas. It floats uselessly, a tantalizing but inaccessible island. Other rafts remain trapped in their housings, jammed by the deformation of the hull, or simply inaccessible due to the fire and smoke. This leaves dozens of men standing on the tilting casing of the submarine with no place to go. They are crowded near the bow, the highest point of the ship, watching the stern disappear beneath the waves. The water is creeping up toward them, inch by inch. As the angle increases, the men lose their footing. Some slide uncontrollably down the long, black slope of the hull, screaming as they hit the water. Others jump voluntarily, choosing the shock of the cold over the terror of being dragged down with the ship. The moment they hit the water, the clock starts. The temperature is 36 degrees Fahrenheit. It is a shock so profound, it feels like a burn. The gasp reflex hits them instantly. Men who are strong swimmers, trained warriors of the Soviet Union, find themselves panicking as their lungs spasm. Those who manage to keep their heads above water swim for the single functional raft. It is already overcrowded. Men are clinging to the sides, their hands slipping on the wet rubber. The raft is designed for perhaps 20 men. There are nearly 50 in the water. Inside the raft, the situation is grim. It is flooded with freezing water. The men are sitting waist-deep in slush. They are shouting, trying to pull their comrades in. "Grab my hand! Pull!"
But as the minutes tick by, the shouting fades.
This is the insidious nature of cold incapacitation. The blood retreats from the hands and feet to protect the vital organs. The muscles in the fingers stiffen and lock. Men trying to grip the ropes on the side of the raft find that their hands simply won't close. They stare at their own fingers, commanding them to move, but the connection between brain and muscle has been severed by the cold. Within 10 minutes, the strongest men begin to falter. They lose the ability to tread water. Their movements become jerky and uncoordinated.
Captain third rank is Penkov. The officer who had managed the electrical systems is seen in the water. He is a large man, powerful. He swims toward the raft, but the cold is faster. He stops swimming. He drifts. His head bobs once, twice, and then he is gone.
From the air, the pilot of the IL-38 watches the scene with horror. He circles low, dropping another survival container. It lands in the water, but it is too far away for the frozen men to reach. To swim 50 meters in that water is a marathon. To swim it without functioning limbs is impossible.
Meanwhile, on the sinking submarine, the final act of the tragedy is playing out. The bow is now pointing almost vertically into the sky, like a tombstone. Captain Van In and a handful of others are still inside. They are trapped. Van In is not on the deck. He has gone back inside. There are conflicting accounts of why. Some say he went back to look for stragglers. Others say he was trying to secure the confidential documents or send a final message. Regardless, when the water washes over the sail, Van In and at least 4 other men are still inside the pressure hull. The hatch slams shut. The water rushes over the seal. The K-228 Komsomolets, the pride of the Soviet Navy, slips beneath the surface for the last time. It descends rapidly. The men inside the water watching it go feel a suction, a pull from the displacement of thousands of tons of water. For the men left floating on the surface, the disappearance of the ship removes their last psychological anchor. They are now alone in the middle of the ocean. The raft is drifting away. The overturned raft is too far. The wind is picking up, whipping the spray into their faces. They begin to sing. It is a surreal, heartbreaking detail recorded by survivors. To keep their spirits up, to keep their minds from shutting down, they sing naval songs. Varyag, the song about the cruiser that refused to surrender. They sing until their teeth chatter so hard they cannot form the words. Then, the singing stops. One by one, the men in the water go silent. They drift away from the group. Their life vests keep them afloat, but their heads slump forward into the water. The cold has reached their hearts. In the raft, the survivors try to huddle together for warmth, but there is no warmth to be found. They are soaking wet. The wind chill is freezing their wet clothes into stiff, icy armor. It takes nearly an hour for the fishing factory ship Alexei Klobistov to arrive. It is a massive vessel, looming out of the mist like a mountain. But for many, it is too late. The crew of the Klobistov throws nets and ladders over the side. They launch their own boats. They begin to pull the men from the water. But the rescue is gruesome. The men are stiff as boards. They cannot climb the ladders. They have to be hauled up by winches or dragged by hand. Some are pulled from the water alive, only to die of cardiac arrest the moment they are laid on the warm deck of the ship. A phenomenon known as rewarming shock, where the cold blood from the limbs rushes back to the heart and stops it. Of the original crew of 69, the count begins. 20 dead. 30. 40. The tragedy is not just that they died, it is how they died. They died within sight of safety. They died because the rafts didn't work. They died because they didn't have survival suits. They died because the system assumed that if the submarine surfaced, the danger was over. The system had prepared them for nuclear war. It had prepared them for depth charges, but it had not prepared them for an hour of swimming in the Norwegian Sea. As the sun sets, the Alexei Klobistov turns for home, its deck covered in bodies and shivering survivors.
The ocean is empty again. But deep below, in the darkness, the story is not quite over. The submarine is falling. It is plummeting toward the bottom, carrying the captain and the remaining trapped men with it. And inside the falling wreck, a final, desperate struggle is taking place. One that will result in one of the most miraculous and horrifying escapes in naval history.
While the survivors on the surface are being pulled from the freezing water, a separate, darker drama is unfolding thousands of feet below them. The K-278 Komsomolets is falling toward the seabed. Inside the pressure hull, 5 men are still alive.
Among them is Captain Van In. When the ship began its final plunge, they were trapped in the central command post. As the water rushed over the sail, the pressure difference slammed the upper hatch shut, sealing them inside a falling tomb. The submarine is now descending rapidly, passing 300 feet, then 500 feet, plunging back into the darkness from which it had just escaped.
But the K-278 has one final card to play: the escape capsule. This device, a specialized titanium chamber integrated into the sail of the submarine, was designed for exactly this moment. It is a lifeboat capable of withstanding the deep ocean. The 5 men scramble into the capsule. It is cramped, dark, and filled with the terrifying noises of the dying ship. The groaning of bulkheads collapsing, the hiss of escaping air, the creaking of the hull under increasing pressure.
They seal the lower hatch, isolating themselves from the flooding command post. They are now passengers in a tiny bubble of air attached to a sinking stone. The depth gauge in the capsule is spinning. 1,000 feet. 1,500 feet.
Captain Van In attempts to activate the release mechanism.
He pulls the lever that fires the explosive bolts designed to sever the capsule from the submarine.
Nothing happens. The mechanism jams. The capsule remains attached. They are being dragged down to the crush depth. Panic, which has been held at bay by discipline for hours, now threatens to take over. The men are screaming, fumbling with the controls in the dark. They are going to die. They are going to be crushed into paste when the hull implodes.
But then, physics intervenes in a way no engineer could have predicted.
As the submarine sinks deeper, the hull begins to deform. The massive pressure of the ocean squeezes the K-278. Somewhere around 5,000 feet, the structural integrity of the main hull fails catastrophically. The submarine implodes.
The violence of the implosion shakes the entire vessel.
And in that chaotic millisecond of destruction, the clamps holding the escape capsule are shattered. The capsule is ripped free. Suddenly, the sensation of falling stops. The capsule is buoyant. It begins to rocket upward.
It shoots toward the surface like a missile.
Inside, the 5 men are slammed against the floor by the G-forces of the ascent. The pressure changes are rapid and brutal. The air inside the capsule is expanding as they rise, making their ears pop painfully. They break the surface with explosive force. The capsule leaps out of the water and splashes down. They have done the impossible. They have escaped a submarine from the bottom of the ocean. They are alive.
But the tragedy of the K-278 is relentless. It does not allow for miracles without a price.
The capsule is bobbing on the waves. The air pressure inside is still higher than the pressure outside because of the rapid ascent. One of the men, Warrant Officer Sliusarenko, reaches for the hatch. He intends to crack it open to get fresh air, to signal for help.
The moment he unlocks the latch,
The internal pressure blows the heavy titanium hatch open with the force of a cannon.
the blast of air ejects another man,
Warrant Officer Chernikov, straight out of the capsule. He is thrown into the sea. The sudden decompression hits the men inside like a hammer.
More critically, the open hatch allows the rough seas to pour in.
The capsule, which is top-heavy and unstable, begins to flood immediately.
Captain Van In and 2 others are still inside.
They are disoriented by the decompression, perhaps unconscious. The water rushes in. The capsule, their savior, becomes a heavy metal bucket.
Sliusarenko,
Who is near the hatch, manages to scramble out before it sinks. He falls into the water. He watches as the capsule, with his commander and 2 comrades inside, slips beneath the waves for the second and final time. It sinks like a stone, taking the men back to the bottom from which they had just returned.
Sarenko is the only survivor from the capsule group. He is pulled from the water by the rescue ships minutes later. He is the witness to the final, cruel joke of the K-278. The system designed to save them worked perfectly, only to kill them because of a single moment of physics at the surface.
The verdict of the system. In the days and weeks that follow, the Soviet Union and the world tries to understand what happened. 42 men are dead. The most advanced submarine in history is lost. The investigation that follows is a study in bureaucratic self-preservation. A specialized state commission is formed. They interview the 27 survivors. They analyze the logs. They study the blueprints. The designers at the Rubin Bureau are quick to point fingers. They blame the crew. They argue that the decision to use compressed air to blow the tanks was a mistake that fed the fire. They argue that the crew failed to seal the compartments properly. They argue that the ship was perfect. The men were flawed. The Navy, in turn, blames the designers. They argue that the wiring in the stern was defective. They argue that the escape capsule was a death trap. They argue that the lack of survival suits was a procurement failure, not a crew failure. And the prosecutors look for a scapegoat. They look for someone to charge with criminal negligence. But as they dig deeper, they find that every individual action was, in its own way, justifiable. Panin followed doctrine by surfacing. The crew followed doctrine by fighting the fire. The rescuers followed doctrine by dispatching ships. In 2002, more than a decade after the disaster, the final official conclusion is released. It is a masterpiece of legal ambiguity. The investigation is closed with the statement, "No individual responsibility could be established." This phrase is chilling. It does not mean it was an accident. It means that the failure was so systemic, so distributed across thousands of decisions made by thousands of people over decades, that no single person could be blamed. It was the fault of the designer who put a high-pressure air line next to a high-voltage cable. It was the fault of the admiral who prioritized missile capacity over life rafts. It was the fault of the budget officer who cut funding for survival suits. It was the fault of the culture that discouraged reporting minor electrical glitches. The verdict confirms what the sailors already knew. The system itself was the killer. The system built a machine that was too complex for its own safety protocols. It created a tightly coupled environment where a small fire could become a catastrophe in minutes. But it provided a loosely coupled rescue response that took hours. The case is closed, but the lack of accountability leaves a bitter taste. The families of the 42 dead receive pensions, medals, and memorials, but they do not receive an admission of guilt. The state admits tragedy, but never error. And while the lawyers close their files, the K-278 Komsomolets remains on the seabed, 5,500 feet down. It is broken, burned, and flooded. But it is not dead. Inside its titanium hull, the nuclear reactor is still there. The torpedoes are still there, and the plutonium they contain is beginning to corrode. The disaster has moved from the realm of human tragedy to environmental threat. The silent aftermath has begun. The legal files are closed. The survivors have gone home. The medals have been handed out to widows and mothers. But the story of K-278 Komsomolets did not end when the investigation was archived. In fact, on the floor of the Norwegian Sea, a new and slower chapter of the disaster is currently being written. The submarine lies at a depth of roughly 1,680 meters, 5,500 feet. It is resting on a slope, buried in the silt. The titanium hull, once impervious to corrosion, is now a tomb for something that will outlast the Soviet Union, the Russian Federation, and perhaps modern civilization itself. Plutonium, the nuclear legacy. When the K-278 went down, it took with it
a nuclear payload that is small in volume but massive in potential toxicity. The primary concern is the reactor. The 190-megawatt pressurized water reactor was shut down by the crew before the ship sank. The control rods are home, and the core is technically secure. The reactor vessel is built of heavy steel alloy, designed to contain immense pressure and radiation. However, the real danger lies in the weapons room. The K-278 carry 2 nuclear-tipped torpedoes. These warheads contain plutonium-239. Unlike uranium, which is dangerous but manageable, plutonium is chemically toxic as well as radioactive. It has a half-life of 24,000 years. If microscopic particles of plutonium enter the food chain, they settle in bone marrow and cause cancer with terrifying efficiency. Salt water is the universal solvent. Over decades, it eats through steel. It eats through seals. The titanium hull of the submarine is resistant, but the torpedo casings inside are not. They are made of standard alloys. Since 1989, the seawater has been gnawing at them. In the early 1990s, shortly after the collapse of the USSR, the world began to worry. The Norwegians, whose fishing grounds are directly above the wreck, demanded answers. The Russians launched a series of expeditions to monitor the site. What they found was disturbing. The wreck is severely damaged. The bow section is cracked open. The internal compartments are exposed to the currents. In the mid-1990s, Russian expeditions took a drastic step to contain the leak. They used submersible robots to seal the torpedo tubes. They effectively glued the front of the submarine shut with specialized titanium caps. They covered the ventilation openings with rubberized blankets to stop the flow of water. For a while, this worked. But the sea is patient. In 2019, a joint Norwegian-Russian expedition returned to the site with advanced ROVs, remotely operated vehicles. They took water samples from the ventilation pipe near the reactor compartment. The results were headline news. One sample showed radiation levels 800,000 times higher than normal seawater. It was a localized cloud of cesium-137 leaking from the wreck. It was not a catastrophic plume. The ocean is vast and dilutes the radiation quickly, but it was proof that the containment is failing. The golden fish is bleeding. This transforms the K-278 from a historical tragedy into an active environmental hazard. It is a ticking clock. Eventually, the torpedo warheads will corrode completely. The plutonium will dissolve. If a significant amount is released at once, it could contaminate the rich fishing grounds of the Norwegian Sea for generations. The only true solution would be to raise the submarine. But raising a 6,000-ton wreck from 5,000 feet is technically nearly impossible and astronomically expensive. And there is a risk that trying to move it could break the hull apart, releasing the radiation instantly. So, the K-278 stays where it is. It is monitored. It is measured. It is feared. It is a ghost that refuses to fade away. The system behind the fire. While the radiation is a physical legacy, the cultural legacy of the disaster is equally toxic. To fully understand why those 42 men died, we must look past the mechanical failures and stare directly at the system that built the ship. The loss of the K-278 was not an anomaly. It was a symptom. It revealed a pattern of behavior within the Soviet military-industrial complex that prioritized performance over resilience. This culture had specific traits that made the disaster inevitable. The secrecy trap. In the Soviet Navy, information was compartmentalized to a pathological degree. A defect found on one submarine was often treated as a state secret, meaning the crew of a sister ship might not be warned about it. Lessons learned were not shared. They were buried. This meant that every crew had to discover the same dangers for themselves. The paper reality. The system valued the appearance of readiness. If a commander reported a problem, his ship might be sidelined, his crew's bonuses cut, and his career stalled. So there was immense pressure to report that everything was excellent. This led to a culture of normalization of deviance.
Small leaks, flickering lights, and glitchy sensors were ignored or patched with duct tape so the mission could proceed.
The complexity gap. The engineers at the Rubin Design Bureau were geniuses.
They could build a titanium hull that defied physics, but they assumed that the people operating it would be perfect. They built a system with tight coupling, where everything is connected. The air system connected to the ballast system, which connected to the fire suppression system.
But the human organizations operating the ship were loose.
They relied on slow chains of command. They relied on manuals that couldn't keep up with the speed of a fire in a titanium tube. They put 21st century hardware in the hands of an organization running on 1940s software.
The fear of blame. When the fire started, the first instinct of the crew was likely hesitation. Is it real? If I trigger the alarm and it's false, I'm in trouble. This hesitation costs seconds. When the capsule failed to detach, panic set in. When the rafts overturned, chaos reigned. The system was built on obedience, not initiative. When the checklist failed, the men didn't know how to improvise because they had been trained that improvisation was dangerous. This is the system behind the fire.
It is not unique to the Soviet Union. We see echoes of it in the Challenger disaster, launch fever, in the Boeing 737 MAX crashes, hiding software to speed up certification, and in the Fukushima meltdown, ignoring tsunami risks to save money.
The K-278 is a mirror.
It shows us what happens when we let our ambition outpace our humility. We build machines that are capable of miracles, but we forget that they are operated by fragile human beings who need breathable air, warmth, and honest information to survive.
The plutonium on the seabed is a physical poison.
But the belief that we can engineer our way out of the need for transparency is a cultural poison. And unlike the plutonium, that poison didn't stay on the ocean floor. It is still with us, in every boardroom and control center where a manager decides to ignore a warning light to keep the schedule on track.
The story of K-278 Komsomolets is now told.
We have followed the titanium hull from the shipyards of Severodvinsk to the crushing depths of the Norwegian Sea. We have watched the fire consume the stern, felt the cold of the water, and witnessed the agonizing failure of the rescue. We have seen the investigation close without a verdict, and the plutonium begin its slow leak into the future.
Now, we must step back and ask the final question.
What does this all mean?
It is easy to categorize this event as a historical curiosity,
a relic of the Cold War, a story about a defunct empire and its reckless ambition. But that would be a mistake. The tragedy of K-278 is not about the Soviet Union. It is about us. It is about the relationship between humanity and the complex systems we build.
The illusion of safety. The primary lesson of the Komsomolets is that complexity is not the same as safety. In fact, complexity is often the enemy of safety. The K-278 was packed with safety systems. It had automated fire suppression. It had a titanium escape capsule. It had redundancies for its redundancies. Yet, when the crisis hit, these systems turned against the crew. The automated air system fed the fire. The escape capsule became a trap. The complexity of the submarine made it impossible for the captain to understand what was happening in real time. We live in a world that is increasingly like the K-278. Our cars are computers. Our power grids are interconnected. Our financial markets are run by algorithms. We are surrounded by titanium hulls, systems that seem invincible because they are advanced. But as the disaster shows, a system can function exactly as designed and still kill people. The valves opened when commanded. The capsule released when the hull crushed. The machine obeyed the laws of physics. It was the interaction of these systems with the chaos of reality that caused the disaster. The cost of denial. The second lesson is about the cost of institutional denial. The Soviet system could not admit that its golden fish was flawed. It could not admit that its rescue capabilities were too slow.
It operated on the assumption that if you don't talk about a risk, the risk disappears.
This denial cost 42 lives.
If the Navy had admitted that the survival suits were insufficient, maybe they would have bought better ones. If the designers had admitted that the compressed air lines were vulnerable, maybe they would have shielded them.
Institutional denial is a comfortable drug. It allows organizations to sleep at night.
But reality always wakes you up eventually. And usually, the wake-up call is a disaster.
The human factor. Finally, we must return to the men. In the analysis of disasters, it is easy to lose sight of the human element. We talk about valves and gaskets and temperature gradients. But the story of K-278 is a story of fathers, sons, and husbands. We must remember Captain Van In, who went back into the sinking ship and died trying to escape in the capsule. We must remember the sailors in the water, singing Varyag as their hearts stopped.
We must remember Seaman Buknikashvili, who died alone in the 7th compartment, the first casualty of the fire.
These men were not victims of a random accident.
They were the collateral damage of a system that placed a mission above the man. They were brave. They were disciplined. They did their duty. But duty is not a shield against freezing water.
Epilogue. The deeper truth.
The ocean did not kill the K-278.
Fire did not kill 42 men. Cold water did. And behind all of it stood a system
Unable to say the most difficult sentence in any language.
We were not ready for what we built.
This is the deeper truth of the K-278. It is a warning that rests on the seabed, 5,500 feet down. It tells us that technology will always outrun our ability to manage it. We will always build ships that are faster than our rescue boats. We will always build reactors that are more complex than our checklists. The gap between our reach and our grasp is where disasters happen. The wreck is still there today. The currents of the Norwegian Sea flow over the shattered titanium. The radiation sensors blink in the darkness, recording the slow decay of the warheads. The ghosts of the crew are gone, but the question they left behind remains.
Are we making the same mistakes? Are we building systems we cannot control?
Are we ignoring the warnings because they are inconvenient?
The K-278 is not a closed chapter.
It is a mirror on the bottom of the world. And if we look closely enough, we can see ourselves in the reflection.
Final statement.
Thank you for spending part of your day with us on this journey into the deep.
This was a heavy story, but an important one.
It reminds us that while we can conquer the physics of the ocean, we can never conquer the frailty of our own biology or the flaws in our own nature.
If this story meant something to you,
if it made you think about the systems in your own life, we'd be honored to have you with us again. Until next time, stay curious, respect the ocean, and take good care.